Hello, I'm Bill Monroe, and welcome to episode 115 of 2-Minute Talk Tips, the podcast that opens with a practical public speaking tip in the first 2 minutes before getting into a deeper discussion about public speaking. Today's tip comes to us from special guest Ari Meisel.
I use a service called Textiful, which makes it really, really easy to short code with the word and everything. And that single-handedly has really changed not only the way I deliver the talks, but the value they bring to me later. So the one tip I think, again, would be that texting thing. I swear that's been such a huge one for me because it just takes the expectation almost of not every speech. A lot of people, they listen to a speech and they know it's going to be motivational or whatnot. But a lot of people almost like nowadays expect to be sold on something. And I feel like they get their guard up. And again, I think that idea of just calling out the elephants in the room, saying to people like, look, there's going to be a thing at the end if you want to give your number or your information, and like we can chat after. But right now I just want to deliver as much value as possible.
Stick around. And after the break, we'll hear more from Ari Meisel. Welcome back. It makes sense that this is one of the shorter episodes of 2-Minute Talk Tips because Ari's brand is all about doing less stuff to maximize your productivity. Really, the focus, though, is on doing the right things for success rather than trying to do everything. Ari Meisel is a self-described overwhelmologist and founder of Less Doing. He helps entrepreneurs who have opportunity in excess of what their infrastructure can support find focus, flexibility, and freedom in their business. The methodology enables founders to become replaceable so they can scale their business even more. So now, let's meet Ari. So Ari, thank you so much for joining us on 2-Minute Talk Tips this week.
Thank you for having me.
You've built a niche out of the idea of less doing, out of being that overwhelmologist, and that's quite a thing to tackle in the world of entrepreneurs and startups and business professionals. But let's go back a little bit and start with, what was your earliest memory of speaking to an audience?
So the first time was in college, actually, as a junior speaking to incoming freshmen, and my heart was pounding out of my chest, and I was trying to be clever, and it was terrible.
Why did it come across as so terrible to you?
It was my first time speaking to a large group. It was about 500 students.
Wow.
They put me and the other student that were speaking on like the top of a staircase, looking down on this pit of 500 students.
So you've got this fear of falling on top of it.
Yeah, it was just weird. And like, I was trying to be clever and talk about how like they're so lucky that they're just starting and I was finishing. And I don't think that landed with anybody. But it was my first experience speaking to a large group in that way. I'd been presenting to classes of like 20, 30 people at a time before that. But this was the first time speaking to what I would consider like a large audience.
And it's amazing how the experience changes when you jump from talking to 20 to 30 people that you know to 500 people that you don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's right. It's like safety, right? One's safe and one isn't.
Right. So how did you eventually get over those nerves and that heart beating out of your chest, or have you?
Oh yeah, no, I have. I love speaking now. So I would say that stuck with me for probably a couple. Sorry. Yeah. So my first very big professional speech was to a group called CEG Worldwide, which is a financial services group out in California. They flew me out. It was the first time I'd been flown out to speak at an event. And I gave this talk and I felt really good and it was comfortable. There were a couple hundred people in the room. What they didn't tell me was that there was a world famous speaking coach as the moderator. And he got up on stage with me at the end of my talk to give me a live critique in front of everybody. Which I was totally unprepared for. He gave really good feedback, and I was like, I thanked him for it. I was gracious, but it was like a smack in the face in such a weird way. Oddly enough, and quit. I mean, it worked out very nicely. And then I got another opportunity to speak at a really, really major event called Genius Network in front of several hundred people who were all like titans of industry. And that same speaking coach was the MC at that event. This was maybe a year later. And I basically like had sort of cemented all the things that he had said and mentioned. And I even said it when I got on stage. I was like, and Joel told me I should point this out. And it just felt comfortable and it went really well. And I think that was, in a way, like a launch in some ways to my speaking career. I did a TEDx talk after that, which was also a really great experience, but a totally different kind of environment. But since then, I've done hundreds of talks, and I get paid to speak all around the world now.
That talk at CEG is probably best they didn't tell you he was going to be critiquing you afterwards in advance.
Yes, I would say so.
So these days, what are you doing in that sort of 5 minutes before you take a stage?
So I do my best, unless people really, unless the host or whoever's organizing really requires it, I try not to have a presentation planned in advance. I mean, in terms of like a PowerPoint, like I really don't like to have slides if I don't have to. Some of them, they say you have to and you do it. But part of that is that I'm really good with my material and I'm very familiar with my material and I can be very fluid with it. So I don't like to get tied into a specific presentation. So a lot of times right before I go on, I'm really trying to read the room in terms of what their needs are and how formal or casual they're going to be, whether or not I can curse or not. I'm just trying to like gauge that sense of what the room is, mostly so I feel comfortable.
So what I think is really key to point out there is you start off by mentioning that, you don't want to necessarily have the talk all planned out in advance in terms of slides, but what you do have in advance is deep knowledge of your material and what you can talk about with that audience. So it sounds like it's not something you go out and you just wing it. It sounds like you've done a lot of the prep work in advance. It's just not necessarily tied to a predefined outline.
Yes, exactly. And I think that delivers way more value to the audience as well, right? Like I'm not coming at them with material, right? I want to bring expertise and opinion to something that I think will really deliver value to them. The other thing that I do, which is not the first one, it's not the 5 minutes before the speech, but in some ways, it really is what I start with most of the time before I get into it. Is I like to tell people, there's a couple things. Like one, so there's always three things. I always say this when I get up. There's three things I just need to tell everybody. I speak really fast, so I like to pack in a lot of information, and I talk fast. So you can slow me down if you need to. Second thing is that I really like to be interrupted, and I mean that. So please don't wait till the end. Ask me a question if it comes up. Just raise your hand, and we'll get to it. And the third thing is that I want to pack in as much information as I can in the time that we're together. But don't worry, at the very end of the presentation, there'll be a simple little text number you can send a keyword to, and you can get all the notes and anything else that I talked about, so you don't have to worry about missing anything. So that's like my preamble. I usually start with that right before I talk about anything. And that just, I think, sort of sets the mood for people.
It's great because it actually tells the audience how to listen to your presentation. It teaches them how to get the material you're about to deliver.
Right, exactly. And also, what it does too is it's that concept of like calling out the elephant in the room. So like I used to have a business partner who was not a very good speaker, but we would do talks together, and he was very monotone in the way that he would talk. Like really, really monotone. So I would literally get up and be like, and so my partner is going to come up and talk. He's got a really monotone voice, but I don't want that to dissuade you. You need to listen to what he has to say because he's brilliant, like that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And then all of a sudden people are like, oh, well, he's not that monotone,
People tend to be a lot more accepting of anything when they expect it, when you've been able to set their expectations appropriately rather than failing to meet their expectations.
Correct.
So you've been talking about how you're able to put a lot of information into a talk. You're teaching them how to consume this. You're giving them extra tools to get more notes and more stuff afterwards. While at the same time, you're studying the idea of being overwhelmed, and your core message is around the idea of less doing. It seems almost ironic. So what do you mean by less doing?
So less doing started as a personal productivity methodology, and the idea was less doing, more living. Now, I don't want people doing less. That is not what we want. We want people doing less of the things that they don't really add value to, that are not in their unique area of genius that they can't focus on, and getting more done. And honestly, taking it more, like in a lot of ways, doing more of a lot of the things that they want to. So less doing was the methodology that I created to help people optimize, automate, and outsource everything that they do in their personal lives. And that has since morphed over the last several years into a business methodology, which we call the Replaceable Founder.
Interesting. So it's more about getting more stuff done by doing less meaningless stuff to you, by wasting less time, it sounds like.
Right. It's very like woo woo and sort of weird. It's a thing that people say a lot, and I don't particularly like saying it, but it does capture it very well, which is that, you're not a human doing, you're a human being, right? And so like we want you being able to do more of these things that you really want to, and that bring value to your life, your family, your friends, your community, and maybe the world at large.
Interesting. So is that also then tie into things like the idea of the 80-20 rule, where, you'll get 80% of your results from 20% of the activity that you do. So maybe don't waste that other time doing that other 80% of stuff that only delivers 20% of the results.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Pareto's principle is definitely one of the things that we talk about, because if you have some sort of restriction in place, whether it's money or space or time is a good one. So let's say that you only had an hour a day to get work done. What would you do? And probably more importantly, what wouldn't you do? Right. So that things still have to get done, whether you can do them or not, probably in your business. So you need to figure out another way, and you have to innovate.
Interesting. So as you're speaking to all these founders and entrepreneurs, the folks who are, these are overachievers. They got where they are by just trying to pack more and more stuff due and pushing harder and harder than other folks would. When they encounter a situation where, there's more stuff to do than they have time, they give up sleep or give up other things to just try and do more. How do you get through to them to the idea of letting go of these less valuable topics, especially if they're things that they do kind of enjoy doing in their business, but don't deliver the value?
It's a problem that comes up, right? Where it's sometimes that we like doing these things. Like there are founders who like doing bookkeeping, right? But they should not be doing bookkeeping. If anything, you want to keep entrepreneurs as far away from the books as possible. So to me, it's usually, the mindset shifts that you get for people are often hard to achieve, but usually worth it. And you look at the changes that you can experience in an organization in your life, and we have the tangible, we have the intangible, and then we have the transformational. And we like to move through those as much as we possibly can to get those transformational changes. And letting go is a big one, because there's so much psychology and emotion rooted in what stops one person from letting go. And at the same time, not letting go is also robbing somebody else of feeling empowered. That's where you get the difference between leading and managing. So if you look at somebody's skill sets and you say, let's talk about the things that you're excellent at, and let's talk about the things that you're competent at, but not excellent at, and then let's talk about the things that you're bad at, and how much time you're spending on any of one of those three categories. And we want to shift that as much as we can so that you're spending as much time as possible on the things that you're excellent at.
Interesting. So it's about sort of refining where they're going to provide the most value there. I think one of the things they talk about on the Managed Tools podcast, which is more about working in that more corporate environment, is the idea of managerial economics 101, which basically says that if you are doing a job that someone who's being paid less than you is capable of doing, then you are wasting the company's money, and you are wasting your time and resources, and you are being irresponsible by doing that yourself instead of having an employee who makes less than you do that job.
Well, and in a lot of ways, right nowadays, that's something that in many cases an automation can do for you. So if you're doing something that an automation can do, then it's dehumanizing work.
So, as a lot of our listeners are, working, they're probably working for somebody else. They're just trying to be more effective at doing all this, and they're speaking at internal meetings, at corporate events, at internal presentations, at sales meetings, and sometimes larger events. When we look at it specifically in the context of speakers, how can they be more effective in building or delivering their talks by applying this principle?
So there's a few. I mean, I go in so many different directions with this. One of them is that I really, and I'm one kind of learner. There's visual learners, audio learners, but I really find a lot of value in watching video, and particularly of myself, whether it's watching a video of me swinging a golf club or speaking on stage. Right, you can see hand motions, and you can learn from those experiences. We're so bad at judging experiences from the inside out. Right, so like when I said that I thought it went terrible when I spoke to that group of students at college, that was my experience, but they might not have thought that. It's this thing in psychology called the spotlight effect, right? Where we think that people notice things so much more about us rather than like being in their own heads. So I think that watching video of yourself is a really, really great way to learn from the experience, and also see like how the audience actually responded to things. I can't tell you how many times I've told what I thought was I said something that I thought was funny, and I got a couple chuckles in the audience, but in retrospect, it turned out it was actually a lot more than that, or vice versa. So that's one thing. As I had mentioned, when I always do this, this little trick, I think, which is that I tell people that at the end of the presentation, there'll be a slide with a number that they can text and get in contact with me. I don't like selling from the stage. I never have and never been particularly good at it. And not to mention, I also think that it takes away from the time that I have to deliver real genuine value. So I make it very non-intrusive. And I say, look, if you missed anything, or you want to talk about anything else, or you want a copy of the slides from today, or you want to hear something more from it, whatever it might be, just text your number, or just text this number with this keyword. So it's like less doing to the number 345-345, and we'll give you anything you want. And that's it. And that's all I say. And it's there, and they can do it if they want to, or they don't. And people have their phones. Everyone has their phones there, and they'll do it. And so that works really well. And it's not necessarily specifically a sales technique, but I think that a lot of speakers don't look beyond the stage in terms of conversations that they might have, because they just want to do the speaking. They want to get in, get out kind of thing. There may be something that they could offer on the back end, and maybe they don't have anything to offer on the back end, but regardless, I think that most people, and speakers particularly, don't do a good enough targeted job of building an email list. And in my opinion, an email list is one of the most powerful things you can have for your business.
Yeah, we're hearing more and more about how, despite social and everything that's happening in LinkedIn and Medium and all these other places which provide a ton of value, the old-fashioned, and it's weird to talk about it this way, the old-fashioned technique of an email distribution list is still what gets results for an awful lot of folks.
Oh, absolutely. I don't. We've just started doing some Facebook ads for a very specific program that we offer, but email marketing has been the most effective and valuable for us because people know us. They're there with our content, like they get to see that, and we get to have conversations.
And it's also one of those things where it's very respectful of a person's time. A Facebook ad they might not be able to deal with at the time that they're dealing with something else, but you send them an email, it'll go into their inbox, and then they can deal with it when they choose to, or they can just go ahead and delete it when they choose to.
That's right.
You also have a podcast called Less Doing. So can you tell us a little bit about that show?
Yeah, so the Less Doing podcast was started 7 years ago.
Wow,
and I know
early days.
Yeah, so my son Ben turned 7 5 days ago, and the second episode of my podcast was the I'm a Dad podcast.
Wow.
So it's kind of cool to see that in retrospect. And I think we're on episode 360 now at this point. And for me, the podcast was always just an excuse to have a conversation with somebody that I thought was interesting that I could learn from. And I've had entrepreneurs, I've had athletes, I've had high performers of all kinds on the podcast. It's just been such a great outlet for me and a great resource and a really great way to get in contact with people, or to get these conversations with people. And I've been fortunate now that I've had Damon John on the podcast. I've had Jordan Belfort, who was the Wolf of Wall Street guy, and all sorts of, and Tim Ferriss has been on the podcast a few times. So it's just been this amazing way to reach an audience and subject matter that I wouldn't have access to otherwise.
Yeah, that is definitely one of the perks of hosting a show is you get to talk to some absolutely amazing people. Which guest has surprised you the most?
Surprised Jordan Belfort was one of the craziest interviews I've ever had. He's an incredible salesperson, obviously, and he's had a very interesting life. And particularly after the movie came out and after he's gone out of jail, he was that was like a high energy podcast episode for sure. That was a good one. Right. So in 7 years doing the show, what lessons have you learned from doing the podcast? Maybe things you didn't know earlier on that have really informed the way you're living your life or running your business now? Well, so the podcast has been a really great place for me to create interesting automation. So we've automated our customer journey. When people book the podcast, they get a text message, they get a voicemail from me, they get a gift that we send them when they're on the podcast itself, and then the dissemination of that information. And it's a really interesting test bed for me. You can do a lot of different testing in terms of when it makes sense to drive people to your website or to have ads versus not have ads. The podcast has gone through a couple iterations of co-hosts that I've had at different times. So it's been an interesting evolution of my career in less doing. And I've had people on the podcast multiple times. So like Tim Ferriss has been on the podcast 3 times, and it was just such a different experience each time. And I think that above all, it's made me better and better at asking questions, which I think is a really important skill set.
It is asking questions is an incredibly valuable skill set when you can do it, and it's something I'm still learning and still working on, and that's one of those things I don't think I'll ever be done learning things like that.
Well, the day we stop learning is the day we die.
Right. So, how can someone take those lessons that they learn from the podcast and from your book and apply those to other aspects of their lives and careers?
It really runs the gamut. The people that I work with, I've had stay-at-home moms, I've had single parents, I've had solopreneurs through Fortune 500s and even the U.S. government that I've worked with. So this method, the OAO methodology, is the one that sort of really applies all across the board. And what that stands for is optimize, automate, outsource. And that order is really important. A lot of people try to outsource first, which is usually a mistake, because if you take a problem that's inefficient and give it to somebody else, it usually gets worse. So it's that lens of looking at things. If you just start with that first O, which is optimize, there's so much going on in our lives on a regular basis, and so much overwhelm that people experience. That's why I jokingly usually refer to myself as the overwhelmologist. That so many people, the overwhelm is because they don't know what's causing the overwhelm. And while that might sound circular, it makes sense, because as humans, when things get over our heads, we tend to just keep going, right? We just put our heads down and we keep going. And that robs us of the opportunity to look for ways to make things better. So the best piece of advice I can give people is just stop sometimes and look at how you do the things that you do and why.
Awesome. So Ari, this has been fantastic. If folks want to know more about you and what you're up to, where should they go?
So the best thing is just go to lessdoing.com. Everything's there, the podcast, the books, the blog, the coaching programs, everything like that. But also if people are interested, they should go to less.do/foundations. And there's this really great mini free video course that we created there, which is part of something which is called the Replaceable Founder. And it's just really valuable, I think, for people who are growing their businesses.
Fantastic. And we'll also have all of those links over at 2minutetalktips.com/lessdoing. So Ari, thank you so much for joining us this week.
Thank you for having me. That was great.
Ari's focus is on making sure business professionals focus on the tasks they are uniquely positioned to accomplish well. With founders and entrepreneurs, this is especially important. Doing other things may be nice or fun, but it can distract from what no one else can do. I mean, it makes sense in the abstract, but it can be tough for some folks in practice. Sometimes doing admin stuff we don't need to be the ones to do is really just procrastination masquerading as productivity. And there's an important lesson for speakers here. At one level, it's about how a speaker or trainer runs their independent business, or how we do the rest of our job if we have a role in a corporation or small or medium-sized business. At another level, though, it's about the content of our talks. It's easy to fill our talks with just too much stuff, with too many details. We might do that because we want to share all the details, because we really love them, because we get excited by them. Or to prove how knowledgeable we are, or because we're afraid to leave something out. It can come from insecurity. We sometimes do the same thing when crafting slides. We put too much on there because we love our content, or we want to make sure it's complete, or because we think we should. In reality, putting too much in a talk or too much on a slide is just as counterproductive as doing too much non-core work in our business. If we overwhelm our audience, we are less likely to land our actual message or point. And if we don't land that, then what is the point? To learn more about Overwhelmologist Ari Meisel, explore the links over at 2minutetalktips.com/Ari. Share this episode with a busy colleague or entrepreneur you know by giving them the link, 2minutetalktips.com/Ari. And of course, as always, don't get best, get better. Thanks a lot. I'm Bill Monroe, and I'll talk to you next week.
Two-Minute Talk Tips is a proud production of the Currently Speaking Podcast Network.